Okay, it's Sunday, which means against my better judgment, it's time to go to Reddit and see what we can find in this hive of scum and villainy. So I've been to the Overwatch University subreddit ahead of time and just scraped all the questions off the first couple pages, and we're going to answer them now while just some footage plays in the background that I had in one of my emails. So, first off is, how is Genji right now? And this person was basically afraid of playing Genji because he'd heard in the past, he or she had heard in the past that Genji has a really high barrier to entry, and also doesn't know how good they are right now. And the answer is Genji's fine. It's really hard for Genji to actually be bad, because Nano Blade is always going to be very strong, unless one of those ultimates gets nerfed dramatically. Then that's always going to be very strong and basically be enough to keep Genji going. And even if the enemy team picks, like, a bunch of counters to Genji, like, Genji still has room to outplay all of his counters, basically. Once you get to, like, alright, so there's a Winston, Bridget, Mei, McCree, things are getting a little obstructive at this point when literally the whole team counters me. But up until that point, Genji remains pretty good, pretty much. Genji's not really as hard as people say he is to play, because he's actually, like, Dragon Blade looks really impressive, sure, but is actually, like, very easy to execute and is more mental than it is, like, mechanical skill, because it's about, like, plotting out the path from A to B more than anything else. And, like, you don't have to play like Seagull to play Genji, because I can play Genji decently well, despite being someone that plays Reinhardt, Bridget, Moira, and recently Mei, right? And because you can play Genji in a very sort of opportunistic, scavenging vulture kind of way, where you just sit really far back and poke and prod at the enemy team, go for the pick if you see an opportunity. But otherwise, you just sit back harassing people until you build your ult, and then you go in and kill, like, several people with Dragon Blade, and there you go, job's done. And killing people with Dragon Blade is really not as hard as it seems, especially if you have an Ana on your team. So Genji's fine, and he's not as hard to play as people say he is, so if you've ever been inclined to play Genji but you were afraid to play him because of the mechanical barrier, it's not as bad as people say he is. Despite being one of the high mechanics heroes, I would say Genji is probably the easiest one to play out of all of them. He's certainly easier than, like, Tracer or Widowmaker, and I would say he's probably easier than Ashe as well. Like, he's not that bad by all accounts. So there you go. Oh, hold on. I gotta get the timer up so I can actually see where I'm at to write down. There, it's okay. All right, great job, mate. Great job, mate. So next up is anyone else too afraid to play DPS in comp, and this was basically a variant on what to do about comp anxiety, and basically revolving around, like, I'm afraid to play DPS because I'm afraid that I'm not going to perform very well and people are going to shit talk me about it. Because as soon as people perform bad, as soon as anything goes wrong, right, it's the DPS's fault, isn't it? Everybody leaps on the DPS immediately, unless, like, the Reinhardt is doing something truly ridiculous, in which case we'll blame the Reinhardt. But, like, if someone's gone wrong, the tanks and healers will doubtlessly blame the DPS, and the other DPS will likely blame the other DPS, because it wasn't my fucking fault, it's that scrub, right? We'd be doing plenty of damage. They'd all be dying if that DPS wasn't bad. I'm the good DPS. Look, here's my gold medal in damage. Don't tell anyone, it's only 2.5k, it's 7 minutes. Right? Like, that kind of thing. And this is a sentiment I've seen a lot of people share. One of my friends is like, yeah, man, DPS is fucking stressful to play, dude. And the advice to give someone, and if any kind of, like, anxiety relating to people shit-talking you pretty much, is just like, don't forget that you'll probably never see these people ever again, right? Like, unless you're in the very, very high SR or the very, very low SRs, you will likely not see the people you played against ever again. You might see them 1 or 2 more games afterwards if you queue, like, immediately. But in all likelihood, you'll never see them again. So after the game ends in like 15 minutes, that person effectively ceases to exist. So what they said no longer really matters. And in like a couple hours, you'll have forgotten about it in all likelihood. They'll have forgotten about it, but they've stopped existing, so it doesn't matter. You know? And if you're really worried about it, you can play like the DPS that are not that hard to play, at least until you get more comfortable doing it. Because any kind of anxiety-related thing, at least in my experience as someone who does suffer from anxiety, is the more you force yourself to do something, the less scary you realize it actually is. That's my experience anyway. Your mileage may vary. But if you play like one of the easier DPS, like Junkrat, or Soldier, Mei, you know, Torbjorn even, like, there's a bunch of DPS that are like pretty easy to play. And you can just play them to get started, and then, you know, sort of get used to doing it, or like playing the DPS playing a DPS in a competitive environment, and then hopefully you realize it's less scary the more you do it, and then you're more comfortable playing the DPS you want to play, if those aren't the DPS that you want to play, you know? And, that's about the best advice you can really give. That's just my experience with anxiety anyway, because I used to be, like, really anxious about a bunch of different stuff, but, like, once you do it a few times, like, what was I really worried about to begin with, you know? But that's just me. That won't be the case for everyone. But that's about the best advice you can really give for someone like that, is something like that is kind of just, like, it gets better. You just kind of have to, like, force yourself to do it a few times, and it's the initial, like, forcing yourself to do it that's the really hard part. So, next up is, this is kind of a long one. I posted a VoD here, and in one of the reviews I was told to not tunnel vision on my team and look at the enemies instead. In another review, I was told that I should be able to spot flankers and still focus on my team. So the question is, who should I be looking at as Mercy? And the answer is that you should be looking at both, if we want to be, like, really direct and to the point about it. Because you need to be, like, you don't need to look at your teammates that much, right? Like, they are your focus, but only as much as you need to know who is in the who currently needs to be healed, and if nobody needs to be healed, who is the best person for me to be damage boosting right now, and then ready to adjust that order as time goes by, because, you know, oh, well, the guy that was good to damage boost is gone, so now damage boost this other guy. Alright, this guy needs healing. Oh, this guy's like half health, but that guy's like a quarter health, so that guy kind of needs my help. Like, that DPS who's at like 20 health needs more help than this tank that's at 400 health, right? Like, you gotta be able to kind of adjust that as time goes by. But you don't really need to be looking at your teammates that much to really do that. As long as you keep in your mind roughly where they all are, you can just kind of like glance around and then move on. Like, alright, well, there they all are, that's how everything is, and then move on and like start looking for flankers. The problem that I've observed people have is that they mostly have trouble processing the information quickly. This is also true of my friend that plays Mercy. But this is what I have generally seen people do, is that they play Mercy, and they look around, and I've seen them just, like, look right at a flanker when they looked around, but not process that he was there, and then go on about their business, but then the flanker comes up behind them and kills them. So it seems like it's more an issue of processing everything really quickly, especially in a game like Overwatch that is pretty fucking fast-paced overall, right? Like, there's a lot of shit going on. So, anyway, it's kind of getting off on a tangent. The goal, basically, is just kind of like, look at your teammates, figure out where they are, keep that roughly in mind, and then be looking for flankers. And if you don't, like, just, you know, over there, alright, no flankers, look back at team, reassess, alright, look over there, reassess team, and just, because you don't need to keep watching the flanks constantly, right? Like, especially if they are a relatively low flank team, right? Like, if they've got one flanker, you can just kind of keep in your mind roughly where you last saw him, and then that will tell you how careful you need to be watching the flanks, right? Because, especially with, like, certain maps where there are just, like, one real way people like to go, or maybe two, right? To me, the, like, main example of something like this is Volskaya, right? Because if you're playing Mercy, you could be sat, like, when you're defending, you can be on second checkpoint is, like, the easiest place to illustrate this, right? You can be sitting on the high ground behind the point, tethered to whoever that you're tethered to at the time, and you can see out the door where the bad men are. So you can see which direction the flankers are going, right? Because they'll usually come through the arch, and then they'll go right. And then if you never see them reappear after coming through the archway, they are probably going to try and go around the right side over the water. But if they're going to go left, you'll see them go left, right? Like, unless they go like a really obtuse way to avoid you seeing them, which no one will do. You're maybe in very high SR, no one will do this. You're going to see them go across the choke point, right? At some point, you're going to see them go left. And then you need to know, then you know that you've got to watch your right. Because, well, they went that way, I don't see them again, that's where they're going, I have to keep an eye over there. And if you just kind of know roughly where they're gonna go, it makes it a lot easier to keep track of these things. Because you know if you saw the Genji go right, well, you can just disregard the other direction suddenly, because he's the only flanker, and I saw him go the other way. So he can't possibly suddenly go the opposite way. So then you have reduced the things you need to keep track of, or the flanks you need to keep track of, by half, and that makes it much easier to keep track of things. So it's more like, it's easier if you can kind of like figure out roughly what the enemy team is likely to do, right? If you're like a Sombra, fuck dude, shit's fucked, she could be anywhere, right? But like, so, and you don't need to keep watching it, you can look over, alright, I don't see him coming, reassess, couple seconds later, is he there? He's still not there. Reassess, couple seconds later, is he there? Oh, there he is, right? Like, as long as you're checking every few seconds, like regularly, you'll see the guy coming before he gets to you. In all likelihood. There will be circumstances where you look away the exact moment he comes around the corner, and you won't see him until he is, like, touching you. But that will be the exception rather than the rule, just statistically. Right? So, that's, like, the best advice I can give for, like, Mercy players keeping track of flanks, is you don't need to be watching them constantly. Just check them somewhat regularly, every few seconds. If you really struggle, like, remembering to do that, especially when things kind of get messy, there are plenty of websites where you can do this, where you can just set up a metronome to tone every now and then, right? So you can just set the metronome to tone, like, somewhere between 2 and 5 seconds, depending on how obsessively you want to check, right? I'd recommend probably, like, 5 seconds is probably like the range. If you're super paranoid, go for like 2. Anything less than that is overkill. But like, you can just set that to tone, however often you set it to tone. And then when you hear it, you check the flank. And then eventually, you won't need the metronome anymore, because eventually it will just become muscle memory. Like, you will condition yourself to do it, so you won't need it anymore. But it can help just to remind you to do it while you're still kind of getting that muscle memory down to actually, like, check now and then. And if your problem is, like, processing the information quickly, I can't really give you advice for that one, other than it should get easier the more often you do it. I've just slapped the keybind, there we go. It should get easier to do the more often you do it. That's about the best I can give you. But that's like, just try and figure out where they're likely to come from, check every now and then. If you struggle remembering, set up like a metronome to do it, and then just check the flank every time you hear it. And it'll get easier as time goes by, hopefully. So there you go. The answer is, look at both, but you don't need to be checking them both obsessively. So, next up is... Hold on, let me write down. We're at... Oh, well, good convenient time. Next up is, if you write it down correctly, Jesus Christ, 75 minutes in? Not quite. Well, hopefully not. Jesus Christ. Next up is, how good do you have to be at tank/support to carry out of your rank? And if we're talking hard carrying out of your rank, it doesn't matter what role you're playing, you need to be several categories better than than the place you currently at to hard carry out. Like, if you are in gold, you need to be, like, a diamond player or better to consistently, like, hard carry a game, right? If you're silver, you need to be, like, platinum or better to consistently hard carry a game, right? You need to be several categories higher to actually hard carry a game out of the SR you're in. Because it's very hard to solo carry in this game, but conversely, it is extremely easy to solo throw in this game. It's a very team-based game, unfortunately. I've never bought into tanks or healers being significantly harder than DPS to carry him, personally, and that's because I played tank and support and didn't have that much trouble climbing to Masters in either role, because I climbed as a tank and I climbed as a support. And the support I climbed as was Moira, who is pretty much like the worst main healer in the game, just compared to everyone else, because she just doesn't compete with Ana or Batista, and Mercy is more of an off-healer to me these days, so Moira just doesn't really compete. But I climbed to Masters as both these roles. I've never actually done it as DPS, to be fair, because I'm bad. And playing the DPS I want to play is hard, because I like Ashe, right? So that's hard. But I've never really bought into support and tank being significantly harder. It's just you need to be better at different skills, right? Because tanks and supports just generally have a lower mechanical requirement to them to play well. Someone like Ana or Batista have kind of high mechanical requirements, but still dramatically lower than, like, any of the DPS that require mechanics, right? Like, they're not that hard. Hammond is, like, probably the highest difficulty tank or support to play in the game, really. Like, Hammond's got a lot of shit going on, right? It's just you require different skills. You can't get by in those roles with, like, raw mechanical skill, which some DPS players do. Where they're, like, not great game sense-wise or anything like that, but they're just, like, really good at clicking on heads accurately as Widow, so they climb off, like, that skill alone without necessarily being incredible at mechanics, or game sense, rather, or meta knowledge. But tanks and healers, you do need to be very good at, like, game sense, comparatively, to actually climb as those heroes. It's just a different set of skills. You need to be a lot better at, like, acknowledging when to push, when to fall back. You need to be, like, way better at grouping with your team. You need to know how to manage your cooldowns properly. You need to know how to use your ults correctly. I find just generally the tanks and supports have, like, the most important ults to get right. Really, because, like, the difference between, like, a good Earth Shatter and a bad Earth Shatter is literally the whole enemy team dies, or no one dies, but your team dies, right? Like, they have some very, using Transcendence well is the difference between winning a team fight or losing the game sometimes, right? Like, they have really important ults to get right. We should skip past this part right here. There we go. So, like, you've got to be better at a different set of skills. Like, cooldown management and ult execution are extremely important skills for supports and tanks. And not many DPS really have to worry about cooldown management, really. McCree does, because of, like, flashbang and roll are, like, important abilities for him. But, like, you think about people like Widowmaker. Soldier's got pretty important cooldown management as well. Biotic Field's very strong. If you think about, like, most DPS, like, they don't have to worry about their cooldowns to the same degree that someone like Ana does, right? That's why, like, some people are like, oh, Ana and Widowmaker have got a lot of crossover. Nah, they got, like, none, really. Ana revolves entirely around cooldown management, and Widow has, like, no cooldowns to manage, except, like, not using grappling hook at a stupid time, basically, right? Like, they don't even aim the same. There's very little overlap between those two heroes, actually. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so, like, you just need to be better at different things, and they're things that are harder to improve upon because they're more nebulous in terms of what you did right and wrong, right? Like, if you're playing Widow, it's very easy to say, oh, well, I could have just clicked on this man's head better, and he's dead, and I'm not dead, and there you go, right? Like, it's very easy to pinpoint the issue with someone like Widow, or McCree, even, like Genji. It's very easy to see the mistake. Well, I used Dragon Blade, and I should have gone for that guy first instead of that guy first, right? Because that guy was easy to kill, that guy's harder to kill, I should have started with the easy one, and progressed up, right? Very easy thing to notice. Whereas, somebody, like, if you're playing like Reinhardt, the mistake you made as Reinhardt can be several minutes removed from the punishment for that action. Because a lot of the times, it's very easy to focus on, like, the last mistake you make, right? Like, the moment that Reinhardt's shield broke, and his team got earth-shattered. You point and you go, you let your shield break there. That's the problem. But the reason that he let his shield break there can have been like a minute in the making ahead of time, right? Because it could have been several instances of poor shield management up until that point that led to it. So you have to, like, extrapolate out further to find what the issue was and what you need to improve upon as a tank and support, which just naturally means that it's like, unless you have the right kind of mindset for these things, it's slower to improve at these heroes, and therefore makes it harder to climb, just by virtue of, like, it being that way. And look, if I'm to be completely honest with you as well, I think most of the reason also that people have trouble climbing as a tank and support is, but frankly, self-pity, where, like, tanks and supports, yeah, they're, like, dependent on their teammates doing stuff, but, like, DPS players are also dependent on their teams doing stuff, right? Like, you can't play 1v6 as any hero in this game. Which is what people always say, pick a DPS and just hard carry the game if you want to climb. If you're playing a DPS, you can be the best, like, fucking Genji player ever, right? But, like, if literally your whole team just picks, like, 4 other DPSs and yada, and they all go off doing their own thing, and all lose their duels, and all get picked off, and constantly stagger, you can't do shit, even though you're the best Genji in the world, because you still can't 1v6 the enemy team, right? Like, they are still going to just turn around and clap you because you're trying to 1v6 them. Like, every hero in this game is dependent on their teammates doing stuff to actually do, like, even flankers, the most, like, independent role in the entire game. If your team is presenting no forward threat at the front line, the enemy team doesn't have to worry about your front line, so they can dedicate most of their energy to stopping you as the flanker and not get punished for it because your teammates are just not doing anything, right? Like, everybody needs their teammates to do something. Supports and tanks are not special in this regard. It's a very team-based game. But supports and tanks players just feel more powerless as people because they don't get to just sit there and click on heads all day and feel like they're having an input, right? Like, the input you have as a tank or a support is oftentimes very invisible. Which, like, you can have a massive impact as a tank or a support, but it is overshadowed by the Genji, that you could have set this Genji up perfectly, right? Like, you as Reinhardt could have commanded space flawlessly and given your backline plenty of room to breathe and, like, drawn all the aggro, which let Genji make his big play. But you get completely overshadowed by the Genji. Everybody looks at the Genji that got all the kills on the play of the game and goes, oh, Genji did that. But it could have easily been Reinhardt. It could have easily been Ana, because she, like... It could be that, like, the McCree was gonna fuck that Genji up, but Ana tranked him right at the start and, like, hit the enemy team with the bio grenade, and that's the only reason that Trance didn't save them, right? Like, Ana made it happen, but Genji's the one that got all the kills and the play of the game, so it looks like Genji did it. So, I think tanks and support players just end up feeling like they have less impact, because their impact is not as obvious or as showy as a DPS is. But they're just as important, it's just not as flashy and obvious. And this leads to, like, tanks and support players being like, oh, there's nothing you can do. I can't do any damage to the enemy team, I can't do as much damage to the enemy team, so I can't kill them, so I can't control the point. Oh my god, DPS are so bad, how am I supposed to do anything? Like, there are plenty of reasons, there are plenty of things you could have done as a tank or a healer still to make the DPS do more damage. You can still do other things to set the game up and carry. It's just harder to see. And if you're playing someone like Mercy, yeah, you got less ways to interact with the game. It's true. It's unfortunate. You can still carry a game as Mercy. There are still people who've gone from Bronze to Masters as Mercy, right? Like, you can still do it. It's just a different set of skills, and it's less obvious what's happening. So, really rambling and incoherent point right there. But the moral of the story is, you have to be better. Like, if you're gonna hard carry as any role, you gotta be several categories better than where you're currently at to hard carry a game. That was what we were originally talking about, like, 10 minutes ago. Isn't that incredible to think about? I'm not in the right window, so I'm just, like, rewinding the footage right now. So, that one took forever. We're going to cut out that question, because I don't consider it to be that important, and we're going to end up going, like, super long otherwise, because that'll just end up being me complaining about stuff. So next up is, are there any particular advantages to certain keybinds? And this person in particular plays Tracer, and I was really surprised by this, but it's actually not, like, that weird compared to some of the things I've heard, but, like, they play Tracer, and they use Shift for their blink, and they bound their ult to right-click, which I was like, holy shit, dude, relax. But, I mean, one of the most common keybindings changes I've heard for Tracer players is use right-click for blink, and then put your ult on Shift, because then you don't have to take your fingers off the movement keys in any way to use your ultimate, right? And this is kind of just a variation of that, in the end. This is a very simple answer to this question, because the answer is, there is no particular advantage to any keybind, no. It just depends on what you personally are most comfortable doing, right? Because I've seen people do some, like, truly degenerate things with their key bindings, where they'll, like, use the numpad keys, right? Like, it's crazy. And I mean, if you're, like, right-handed, that ends up, or if you're left-handed, rather, that ends up making more sense for people. But, like, no, I've seen people who are right-handed and are just like, yeah, no, I'm gonna take my hand off the keyboard to use this numpad key real quick, or my hand off the mouse to use this numpad key real quick. Like, I've seen people do some fucking crazy stuff with their keybinds, right? And as long as you're not doing something, like, truly ridiculous, where you have to reach, like, the whole way across the keyboard to, like, use your ultimate, like, it's fine. Just do whatever is most comfortable for you. There's no, like, intrinsic benefit to anything. One that I do personally recommend very highly is for Pharah, rebind Concussive Blast to right-click. Because right-click by default is your boosters, or your jetpack, right? Not the jump jet. It's just the jetpack. But everybody uses space for the jetpack. And Concussive Blast by default on E just doesn't feel right to me. Like, it feels like a right-click ability. So I highly recommend rebinding Pharah's Concussive Blast to right-click. But, like, outside of that, like, alright, even that, like, you might disagree, right? Like, you're free to disagree with whatever the fuck you want. You do you, champ. But, no, there's no intrinsic benefit to any particular keybinding. It's just whatever you're most comfortable doing, dog. So, next up is, why do gold players refuse to focus supports? And this person specifically used the example of, they'll focus the Hammond who's getting pocketed by two healers, rather than kill the two healers, or crowd control the two healers, so that the Hammond's not getting healed for a while. And this ties in to my earlier point about supports and tanks having a kind of invisible effect compared to a DPS, right? Hammond, in this instance, is extremely overshadowing the supports, right? Most gold players at least, are going to be looking at the Hammond spinning on the point and go, fucking Hammond just won't die, dude. Oh my god, this hero is ridiculous. Not realizing this is actually entirely the work of the Ana over there, who is doing her best to keep this Hammond alive while he's doing some dumbass shit, right? Like, it's just harder to notice the Ana by default, and it's not what most people's default thing is going to be. They're not going to look at the Hammond and go, well, why is the Hammond so hard to kill? Oh, it must be that person all the way over there, right? Like, that's not going to be most people's line of thought. Most people are going to look at the Hammond spinning on the point and just go, he's really fucking hard to hit, and he's got a lot of hit points, dude, and oh my god, have you seen that shield? He can get sometimes, it can be like 700 health. Hammond's a fucking tanky boy, right? Like, it's just the more obvious issue at hand. So I think that's most of the issue with, like, lower ranked players focusing supports is that it's just not as obvious to them that the supports are the ones that are making something happen. They see the Reinhardt swinging into the enemy team, and they go, Jesus Christ, Reinhardt does a lot of damage, we just can't get this guy off of us, he just keeps coming, it's like he doesn't fucking die, oblivious to the fact that that's because Moira has stood behind him, just like, pumping as much healing into him as she can, because he's playing like a suicidal fool, right? Like, it's not as obvious as the giant German man swinging the hammer in your face, right? Like, it's just the more obvious thing. So I think that's the issue with, like, lower ranked players not focusing supports. It's just not as obvious. So, like, if they don't, like, pay attention, if they don't learn that the support is the reason this is happening, they'll never figure it out. Like, they need to figure it out. They need to, like, look at it and go, well, wait, why does it seem like Reinhardt doesn't die, right? Like, they need to actually think that, or have it pointed out to them that, like, what's happening right now, Moira's making that happen, not the Reinhardt, because it's not obvious if you're just, like, looking at it head on. So I think that's the issue. It's just that, like, supports have a less obvious impact on the game, which leads to people undervaluing the importance of focusing the supports. Though, simultaneously, I've seen plenty of lower-ranked players who overvalue focusing the supports and will, like, suicide dive supports when they could have gotten the fucking DPS, because the DPS is standing out in the middle of nowhere by himself, but they'll just, like, walk past the DPS to get the supports. So I've seen the problem go in the opposite direction just as much as I've seen that problem as well. But I think that's the main issue. And next up is... we'll see how long. I've got maybe 2 questions. We'll see how long I end up rambling about this one first. Next up is it better to pop Fortify to save my life, or will I still have more armor to potentially not need to be in need of life saving? A little bit of an awkwardly worded question, but we get the point. So, with all damage reduction abilities, right? We don't have that many of them, but with all damage reduction things, really, the goal is to use it when you are about to take the most damage, right? Because using it after you have already taken all of the damage doesn't really accomplish very much. The goal is to negate the damage. It's damage reduction. So you want to use it when it is likely to reduce the most amount of damage possible, which is usually going to mean use it sooner rather than later. And, like, if we talk about, like, IRISA specifically, right, with Fortify, if, like, the Tracer is coming at you, the Tracer's goal is to get you low enough that she can pulse bomb you, right? Like, because if you harass the IRISA as Tracer, if you can get IRISA down low enough before she pops Fortify, you can just stick her and it'll kill her through Fortify regardless, right? So, like, that's the goal, is to get her down to the point where if she pops Fortify, I can kill her anyway, and if she doesn't pop Fortify, I just kill her by shooting her, right? Like, that kind of thing happens. So the goal is to use Fortify as soon as Tracer commits, because then she can never get you to the point where she would be able to kill you regardless, right? Like, she has to spend... Because Fortify lasts fucking forever, dude. Like, she has to spend so long working at you while you're at Fortify that she never has the opportunity to get you low enough to kill you to begin with. And if, like, the whole enemy team is just, like, rushing in at you, you want to use Fortify, like, when you think they're about to do the most damage to you, right? Like, because you want to negate as much as possible. Using Fortify when you're already about to die is not very productive, because if you use it when you have max health, you've effectively, like, not quite doubled, but you've, like, close to doubled your, hit points, whereas if you use it when you're, like, at 100 hit points left, you've effectively doubled, like, 100 hit points, so, like, great. It's not even quite doubled. You get the idea. You've not increased as much relative to if you used it earlier. So, the short answer is use it sooner rather than later, because using it after you've already taken all of the damage is a lot like locking the stable door after the horse has already run away, you know? The hit points aren't coming back, unfortunately. Better to just keep them in there to begin with. So, we'll do the last question as well. Last question for this week is, why is IRISA considered OP? We answered a question similar to this, I think, a week or 2 ago at this point. And I personally don't think IRISA is OP. I just think the meta favors IRISA, and IRISA is way easier to play than most of the other tanks in the game. So I think that's the main thing here. But the thing is, like, the reason IRISA has suddenly become so popular is because bunker comps in general got a massive boost by Batista being added to the game. Because, right, like, he is a great facilitator for bunker comps, particularly the Bastion variant of the bunker comps, right? So, and just, the bunkers are very easy to play, right? Like, they're very easy to play. IRISA is very easy to play. Roadhog is very easy to play. Bastion is very easy to play. Torbjorn and Symmetra are very easy to play. Batista is not especially easy to play, but he's not like fucking Widowmaker levels of difficult, right? Like, you don't need to be incredible. And if the enemy team are not going to play around the bunker properly, you only have to be able to basically aim your right click and E as Batista, and that will be good enough if the enemy team doesn't want to play against the bunker properly, right? So, like, that's the main thing with, like, the IRISA comps right now to me, is that it's just easy to play these heroes, and Batista being in the game makes it way more appealing to play those kinds of comps, especially in competitive or in ladder, where teamwork is very hard to come by. Bunker comps, even though they're built on teamwork, they don't require hard teamwork to make work, right? It's all rally around the thing we're built around and keep it alive, right? It's very easy to actually do that. Doesn't really require a whole lot of coordination. Just needs all of the people involved to kind of just know what their hero does a little bit, and that's it. Whereas, conversely, the team playing against the bunker does need to use a lot of teamwork to defeat the bunker. Because if the enemy team treats the fighting the bunker as they would like any other situation where they can kind of just sort of do their own thing and get by, that doesn't work, because the one person doing their own thing trying to get by is trying to get by versus like 3+ other people at all times, right? Like, you can't do it. So it's easy to play. All of the heroes are easy to play. Batista being added to the game makes bunkers significantly stronger. It's not hard to get people to work together with a bunker comp because it's very simple teamwork, and the enemy team needs to execute more complicated teamwork to get it to work, to defeat the bunker. And teamwork in general is hard to come by in competitive, right? Like, it's hard to find. So, like, the kind of teamwork necessary to beat a bunker comp is even harder to come by. This is why every time I go to the Overwatch University subreddit, like, without fail, I will find a thread that says something to the effect of, what the fuck do you do versus a bunker as insert role or hero here, right? Like, it's hard for people to deal with these situations because they're hard for one person to deal with. So, that's why IRISA's OP. It's actually because Batista's OP. He's not actually, it's just people are bad. That's the actual truth of the issue. So there you go. So, thank you very much for watching if you did. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to answer. If you haven't already, join our Discord and ask questions more directly and have a conversation about them, or just shitpost with us. I've started streaming on Twitch Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, 8 p.m. EST till midnight EST. There's a link to the channel in the description. And if you managed to make it all the way through the video and somehow still enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe for more content of middling quality in the future, and I hope you found the video helpful.